I was going to make a long video about The Surge 2, but for technical reasons I can't record that game. So let's talk about Deck 13's first game, Lords of the Fallen. It's going to be almost impossible for me to talk about Lords of the Fallen without mentioning Dark Souls. See, Lords of the Fallen is a copycat, a clone. I think it's fair to say that if Dark Souls wasn't a breakout hit, then Lords of the Fallen wouldn't exist. But while Lords of the Fallen is similar to Dark Souls in many ways, I think the hate it gets online isn't really fair. I'll get into this more later, but for now it will suffice to say that I think most of the hate Deck 13's games get is due to Lords of the Fallen being one of the first big budget Dark Souls clones, and not for any problems with the games themselves. In the case of Lords of the Fallen, if it does something the same as Dark Souls, it's a rip-off. If it does something different from Dark Souls, it's bad for being different from Dark Souls. If it does something worse than Dark Souls, it's proof that Lords of the Fallen sucks. If it does something better than Dark Souls, whatever that thing is dismissed as unimportant or is simply ignored. A great example is the way that Lords of the Fallen is criticised because most of the enemies are humanoids. But most of the enemies in Dark Souls are also humanoids, but it's considered okay in that game because reasons. As you've no doubt guessed, I like Lords of the Fallen, at least somewhat. It's far from my favourite game, but it's a solid 6 out of 10, and far from the irredeemable turd people describe it as. Lords of the Fallen doesn't really have a traditional character creator. You play as Harkon, and his appearance is preset. But what class he is and the choices he makes along the way are left for you to decide. There's basically 3 classes to choose from: Fighter, Rogue and Monk, and 3 skills of magic that fall into those 3 classes. You can mix and match, but I don't really see the point, as only the Monk is really going to be doing magic anyway, unless you're going for some kind of unusual build. And builds do actually work in this game. I played as a fighter for this run, and unlike other Souls-like games, armour is actually useful. A tank can actually take some hits, and hits back like a truck. I'll get into balance a bit more later, but for now I recommend playing as a fighter for your first playthrough, putting points into strength, vitality, and maybe some into energy. I will point out now that I don't mind that you can't change your character's appearance or name. I generally choose a preset with a different haircut anyway, as messing with sliders tends to result in characters that look weird to me. I get that people like putting all the dials to maximum or minimum to make some kind of horrible abomination, but I find that to be a joke that gets boring after about 5 minutes. The story of this game is simultaneously straightforward and needlessly confusing. The setup is simple. You are Harkon, an ex-con who's been let out of prison to help a monk find someone named Artanis, who is something of a hero in these parts. Artanis is apparently the key to stopping the demon invasion. In a sense, you are the muscle tasked with clearing the way. Sounds simple, and it is, but the moment-to-moment story doesn't make much sense, or at least it's poorly paced. For example, the first boss knocks your friend through a door, which then collapses. After the boss, you have to find a way to your injured friend. This detour took so long that I thought I'd missed something. A cutscene trigger, or a critical path, or something my first time playing. But no, it just takes you a while to find him. It's the Fallout 4 problem of having an urgent, time-sensitive mission, but gameplay-wise you're encouraged to dick around exploring and doing side quests. Another example is when you're sent through a portal to kill a rogue lord. You do so, and when you return, your companions are missing. They went to the Citadel. What Citadel? Where is the Citadel? I can get there through the catacombs. What catacombs? This makes sense later, but first time through, this stuff seems to be more confusing than it needs to be. Also, if Harkon is needed as a bodyguard, how do my companions keep running off alone through dangerous high-level areas, while injured in some cases, and arrive just fine, only to send you away again on another errand? Again, this all makes sense on a macro scale once you know the story and what's going on, but first time, your actual minute-to-minute story is kind of confusing. Side quests also tend to have the same problem. A great example is an early quest where you have to find symbols on walls that mark the way to a safe room. What these symbols look like and how far you're meant to search for them is not answered. One is even on the side of some stairs where it wouldn't be visible if you were following them like a breadcrumb trail. The game also has a bunch of choices to make. One that happened a few times is permanently giving up a healing potion to heal a wounded NPC. I gave up the healing item each time I was asked and still ended up with a cap of 9 potions, which was plenty. But these quests didn't really pay off. I'm guessing there are future quest chains to follow that I never completed. One bizarre quest involved one of these NPCs, a guy early on whose arm I cut off to prevent the spread of poison. I met him later and he asked me to clear the way to his lab. When I talked to him again, without leaving the room, Harkin said that the way was clear and the man wanted to meet me at his lab. What lab? How do I get there? I never did find him, by the way. Another quest involved a woman looking for something related to a book she inherited. I barely did anything that she asked, and somehow I still completed her quest line. Lords of the Fallen is a fairly long game, at least on the first playthrough, so I couldn't be bothered with side quests by the end of it. What surprised me though was at the end of the game you get a Fallout New Vegas style ending that talks about the results of your choices and gameplay style, one even commenting that I wasn't a scholar, likely because I didn't go out of my way to find all of the secrets. Some of the things I had no idea were things I could do, let alone were part of choices I could make. It's hard to talk about the gameplay of Lords of the Fallen without referencing Dark Souls, or at least using Dark Souls terms, since Lords uses generic terms that don't really describe anything. If I say you drop XP on death, that doesn't make much sense. Saying you drop souls when you die doesn't make much sense on its own either, but because XP is a common phrase used in RPGs, and it's not usually something you can drop, it makes more sense to talk about souls than it does XP. So for those who are somehow unfamiliar with Dark Souls, let me explain how it works. It's a third-person action game. Attacks are bound to the shoulder buttons, but instead of combo memorization, the skill comes from a stamina bar and slow attack animations. See, generally speaking, you can't take many hits and can only do a few attacks before needing to wait a second or two before your stamina recovers. This means you have to pick your attacks carefully and can't rely purely on button mashing or quick reflexes. However, enemies also play by the same rules. This gives combat a sense of deliberateness and lethality not seen in most action games. You get souls from defeating enemies and you use these souls to buy level ups. When you die, you drop any that you are carrying and have to retrieve them before you die again, otherwise they are gone. This is where the game splits from Dark Souls a bit. You are incentivized to carry more souls before banking them, as this builds up a multiplier, and I think it ups the drop rate on items as well, but I'm not sure. And while levels are very important to this game, just like in other RPGs, they are not as important, meaning it's technically possible to skill your way through combat encounters if you're good enough, something that's not generally true of most RPGs.
What is this precious thing you seek?
It is a crystal, a very special crystal. A crystal that can rend a tear between the realms. A tear powerful enough to distort other ruptures.
The Rogar could be using that crystal to enter our world.
You will find the crystal itself in the place of power. A place where all energy gathers. Take it away, and the Rogar lords will travel no more. Then, bring it back to me. Yes.
One of the other mechanics that Dark Souls is well known for is the bonfire system and healing. In Dark Souls, drinking healing items takes a little bit of time, leaving you exposed during combat. A poorly timed heal can be fatal. This is true in Lords as well. Where Lords differs from Dark Souls is the bonfire system. In Dark Souls, resting at a bonfire refills all of your healing items, but makes all of the enemies respawn. The idea being that you have to keep trying an area over and over again, slowly growing in skill and power until you master it and can get through the entire area without using all of your healing items. Lords of the Fallen doesn't do this. Enemies stay dead when you rest, and you only get a few healing charges back at a time. And you can't just rest multiple times in a row. You only get a full refill by dying. Enemies only respawn if you die or leave an area through a loading screen. These are bad changes in my opinion. I get that it cuts down on the tedious grind of killing the same enemies over and over again, but it also means that the only penalty for resting is you lose your experience point multiplier, which you might not care about. I could see the logic. It allows you to rest without having to kill the same enemies over and over, but because the player could easily abuse this for infinite healing, the refills are kept on a cooldown. While I never got to the point of deliberately killing myself for a full refill, I can see why some people might do that, especially later in the game when I had 9 healing potions. They seem to have learned from this mistake though, as the Surge games have a more Dark Souls-esque approach to resting and healing. Since combat makes up a lot of the game, it's good that Lords of the Fallen does it fairly well. Despite the fairly simple controls, you have a lot of moves at your disposal. Sprinting and pressing heavy attack does a running attack. You can dodge roll into a weapon swing with some weapons. Each weapon can be used one-handed or two-handed, with smaller weapons being dual-wielded in two-handed stance. It all works. Hitboxes seem to be well done. There's few, if any, attacks where enemies turn mid-swing in order to land a blow, and hitboxes are generally pretty good, with only 2 that I really remember being an issue. One was an overhead swing on the first boss of the game, and one that was a shield on the second boss, blocking my attack when it felt like I was hitting around it. None of these were game breaking though. I don't know for sure, but I think I might have took some damage even on a successful parry, but I've not used parrying enough to be sure. Then there's the camera. I don't recall many camera issues in Lords of the Fallen. I'm guessing there were times when it would get stuck in a corner while I was swarmed with enemies, but not often enough that I really remember. The camera pulls back for bigger bosses as well, which is nice. One of the issues with the camera is that the camera shake can get a bit extreme and lasts a little bit longer than it should. It's not game breaking or anything, but it is something I noticed. Magic in the game is fairly simple. Each school has 4 spells, 3 really, because they all share a variation of the prayer spell, which creates a false target to distract enemies. Spells take a while to cast and are gated behind a faith requirement, though the requirements are not particularly outrageous if you want to dabble. But the main use for magic is the magic gauntlet. It can shoot a projectile, a shotgun-like short-range blast, and an explosive grenade. Putting elemental gems into each fire mode changes them. Some are fairly minor changes, like adding a damage over time fire effect to a shot. Others are more drastic, like turning the blast into an area of effect ground slam, or explosive shot into a magic gun turret. Put it all together and what you end up with is 3 pure classes, an agility dodge build relying on daggers and knuckle dusters, a magic all-rounder that hits things with a hammer and weakens them at range with powerful spells, and a man wrapped in tin that moves like a truck and hits like one too. I'm guessing it's possible to build stuff in between those extremes, but that's not something I've really messed with. And this is the point in the video where I'm going to complain about Dark Souls. It's really tempting to go on a tirade about Soulsborne's fans, mocking them with silly voices and contradictory strawman arguments. I know some sane, rational people who are Dark Souls fans, but some of them seem to lose all sanity when it comes to that series. It's a bit like Silent Hill. I know a lot of people who like the games, but they seem to turn into different people when someone points out a valid complaint or highlights their contradictory demands. Now, I know what the two counter-arguments to this are. One is that I shouldn't care what other people think. A nice sentiment, but as soon as I have an opinion that differs from theirs, I suddenly need to value their opinion and give them a chance to change my mind. The second, the more reasonable argument, is that the fan base is made up of many people with different opinions and that I shouldn't try and collate them all together into a single fan base approved opinion, which I admit is a fair point. Though where I draw the line is expecting me to find multiple examples of the same person saying two contradictory things, because even if such evidence is provided, it's hand waved away as not counting. As I said earlier in the video, I find it frustrating and kind of stupid that Dark Souls fans will hold Lords of the Fallen and other Deck 13 Souls-like games to a standard that not even Dark Souls manages to match. For example, I've played Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3. I've seen popular videos like Joseph Anderson's critiques of the Soulsborne games and Matthew Matosis's video on Dark Souls 2. I think it's reasonable to say that the whole tough but fair argument often made by Dark Souls fans isn't always true. There is some degree of cheap traps, trial and error bullshit, and a few cases of unavoidable damage. There are bridges made of flimsy planks that don't collapse when stepped on, but there are solid stone floors that do collapse when stepped on. But I can't think of any such inconsistencies or trial and error situations in Lords of the Fallen. The closest to a cheap trap is a room with holes in the floor, but those are easily avoided first time if you're paying any attention. There's a bit in the catacombs where a spider drops down behind you if you rush into a room to grab a chest, but you have plenty of time to react. Then there's the world design. I don't think the world design in Lords of the Fallen is great. The placement of bonfires is iffy, I tend to get lost a lot. But given how Soulsborne fans keep complaining that none of the Souls games have done an interconnected world after Dark Souls 1, you'd think that they'd be happy that Lords of the Fallen does this, but the game doesn't seem to get any credit for it. And I can keep going on with the examples. Hit detection and backstabs are more consistent in Lords than in Dark Souls. People accuse Lords of the Fallen of having too many humanoid enemies, but Dark Souls also has a lot of humanoid enemies, but that's okay for some reason. I think you get the idea. In a weird way, Lords of the Fallen not being as popular as Dark Souls also means it avoids a lot of the problems that Dark Souls has with toxic fans. One of the things that puts me off Dark Souls is all the stupid rules and advice I receive before, during and after playing the games. Over the years I've heard a run is not legitimate if you use any of the following: using items, summoning allies, doing any magic aside from the healing miracle, using ranged weapons for anything other than cutting the tail off the dragon, using dual-wielding power stance, or if you end up overleveled at any point. That's huge chunks of the game's features cut off from you, because using any of those things is akin to playing on baby mode and thus makes a run illegitimate. You might see the end credits, but you haven't really beaten Dark Souls. Just to take one example, Dark Souls has a whole magic system to play with. There are entire starting classes built around it and items that make magic builds even stronger, but using any of it delegitimizes the playthrough in the eyes of some Dark Souls fans. Lords of the Fallen and Deck 13's other games don't have this problem or limitation. You can use whatever magic and items and builds that you like. You want to put a few points into magic so that you can set a ghost on fire? Go for it. Where these criticisms get even more bizarre is that people will criticize Lords of the Fallen for not having online features like player invasions and co-op summons. You know, the same co-op summons and online features that you're not supposed to use in Dark Souls if you want a legit playthrough. No, I don't get it either. Let's look at the graphics. This might not be apparent in my blurry 720p 30 frames a second recording, but Lords of the Fallen looks great. Textures are sharp, armour is high detail with a bulky, larger-than-life look to it, with a lot of flowing capes. Robes can look a little goofy, but it's still well made. Combat and movement animations feel suitably heavy as well. The environments and enemies look good too, and it all runs at a smooth and stable frame rate. You might be thinking that graphics don't matter, that how a game looks is secondary to how it plays, and that is fair, but if that's your standard, you also can't hold the game's over-the-top conversation animations against it. I can't really talk about balance because I've only really played the pure classes, and there's some debate online about which class is the best. I went pure fighter for this playthrough and felt overpowered around the middle of the game. I played a couple of hours as monk and breezed through the early game and then hit a mid-game stumbling block. Whether this was due to my increased skill or the class itself is hard to say for sure. I played a thief ages ago and had a hard time, but I've read of people beating the game in under an hour with the thief, so I have no idea. The fact that there's some debate makes me think that the game is fairly well balanced overall, and while I recommend a fighter for the first playthrough, you can play however you like. One thing less balanced are the weapons. I got the Fate Axe fairly early on in the game. You can find it with a bit of exploring, and it carried me through most of the game, easily usable in one-handed or two-handed and doing a ton of damage both ways. Add in good stat scaling and it was a beast. Another weapon, the Justice Sword, carried me through the late game with similar results, massive one-handed damage. There were other effective weapons, it's just these two were the most powerful. I didn't get far enough with the other classes to see if there were super weapons for those classes, but it wouldn't surprise me. Many of the bosses I beat on my first or second try, and I don't consider that a failure of the game. I had a good build and I think I played it well. A few changes to my gear were enough to turn the tide against the tougher bosses. I don't know if magic would make things easier or more difficult. At very least, the bosses rarely felt cheap and unfair, though I was playing as a fighter that could take a hit or two. Either way, I'll take easy, fun, and fair over difficult, cheap damage sponges. As I said earlier in the video, Dark Souls YouTubers will often cite one of the best things in the game being that the levels are all interconnected and loop back in on themselves. Lords of the Fallen has that, but just because it has it doesn't mean it's good. The monastery's a tangled mess of hallways, ramparts and staircases. Areas tend to blend together and important places are easy to miss, or at least to me. This combines with the story and quests that, while making sense as a whole, don't make sense moment to moment. To use an earlier example, in one part of the game I came back through a portal only to find my allies weren't waiting for me. I was given the instruction to go through the catacombs under the monastery, but the whole game is set in one big monastery. There's like 2 or 3 church-like buildings. Is that what it means? No, it turns out it wanted me to go through an easily missed door in the graveyard. And why did my allies go through the catacombs? I don't know. Even the map that comes with the fancy edition of the game is about as useful as a chocolate fireguard, and is completely worthless as a navigation aid. The placement of bonfires isn't great either. The ones before the bosses, I get, but most of them seem to be scattered around almost randomly. In the Surge, bonfires were placed in a way that you explore out from them, using only one per area. That's not the case here. This is made all the stranger by the way enemies don't respawn when you rest, only when you die or change areas. It's weird. Before I get to the conclusion, I want to talk about some of the stuff that didn't really fit anywhere else in the review. One little detail I liked was that if you have a shield equipped but you're not holding it in your hand, it's on your back. Fair enough, but it will still block some attacks there. I only noticed it when running away from archers. It's a silly but fun detail. Speaking of things on the back, awkward segue, but backstabs are easy to get in this game. At very least, they seem consistent enough that I could reliably pull them off on enemies that could be backstabbed. Sneaking up on enemies rarely worked, but what did work was certain attacks or defensive moves that would leave the enemies open to a backstab. Getting good at this does require practice and arguably adds another tool that makes you overpowered, but it's fun to do and it doesn't work against certain enemies, usually the bigger ones. I think it's worth noting that other Souls-like games, including Code Vein and even Dark Souls itself, similarly allow you to exploit backstabs fairly easily in this way. Maybe this mechanic needs to be changed or even removed entirely, but that's a topic for another time. One thing I noticed in Lords of the Fallen, or at least something I think I noticed, is that enemies play by the same rules as the player when it comes to stamina. There are Souls-like games that don't seem to do this. Now I can't confirm it without being able to see their stamina bars, but Dark Souls 3 has enemies that will flail around seemingly without limit. Lords of the Fallen doesn't seem to have this. Again, I can't be sure, but it felt like I could guard break shield enemies simply by wearing down their stamina, either by spamming powerful attacks if I was higher level than them, or by hitting them after they spammed attacks. There are one-use consumables in the game. Most are useless and I never really used them, like poison resistance or lightning resistance. One useful one though was a rare item that returned your dropped souls to you, handy if you died to a boss or in a hard to reach place with a lot of souls. Generally speaking, everything is a lot more straightforward in Lords of the Fallen. The story isn't as vague or convoluted, the stats are clearly explained with obvious effects, even if the menus are a bit busy and poorly laid out. Even the difficulty comes from straight combat in the game instead of trying to trick you with trial and error traps, ambushes and other gimmicks. It cuts all the nonsense and gets right to the point. I also want to say something about stability. The game crashed on me once during my entire playthrough, maybe twice. Now, perhaps I was lucky and the game has been patched since release, but complaints about the game being buggy don't seem to be true. I recently played Dark Souls 3 again and that game had a bunch of technical problems, including crashing on me at least twice. Again, I don't see how Lords of the Fallen can have a reputation as a buggy mess and not Dark Souls 3, even though Dark Souls 3 is far worse in terms of bugs. So to summarise, Deck 13's Lords of the Fallen is an underrated game in my opinion. Yes, it is a rip-off in the sense that the game likely wouldn't exist if Dark Souls didn't make an oil tanker full of cash. While far from my favourite game, and I don't know if I would recommend it, I find the combat to be fun enough, and in some ways the game is better than Dark Souls. At very least, it's not the completely irredeemable mess that people make it out to be. It's a decent, if unremarkable, game.
Crystal.